Welcome to the SOLA Network. My name is Moses and I serve on the SOLA Editorial team. Today, I have the great privilege to introduce you to today's guest. And he's no stranger to SOLA, but here's a brief introduction. Mitchel Lee has been serving as the lead pastor of Grace Community Church since the fall of 2016. His formal education, theological education, started in South Korea, followed by North Carolina for seminary, then to Chicago for further grad school. He's married to Sarah, and they have 5 kids together from ages 14 to 4. But today, we're not here to talk about his family per se. We're actually here to talk about Mitchel's first book called Even If, which is due to be released in August this month of this year. So, yeah, congratulations on your book, Even If, Mitchel. We're so honored to have you here. Can you just give us a brief overview of the book and what it's about?
Yeah, thanks, Moses. It's fun to be able to talk about the book with a friend as well. And I'm just really excited about the things God's doing in your life and your ministry as well. Yeah, this Even If book, it's a message that God has been writing in my heart for about 19 years. And like most things that God does, he really birthed this thing out of great pain, out of great disappointment. I would even say disillusionment, in a place of that wilderness where I thought ministry wise I was done. And I had to really come to grips with who I believed God to be, even when my life didn't really show it. And what I mean by that is the message of Even If comes out of Daniel chapter 3. And it's this short encounter exchange between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar, you probably all know the story, right? Nebuchadnezzar gets this counsel that he should build a big statue, play a song, and everybody who in the land who listens should bow down to it. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow. And the uncomfortable and awkward situation in that is they are some of his royal advisors. And so he has this confrontation and he lights up a furnace and he says, if you will not bow to me, then I'm going to throw you in this furnace. And their response is so crucial and yet so curious. They say two things in their response. They say, first, we don't even really need to answer you in this matter, right? But Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful leader person on the planet at this time. And they say, we don't even need to answer you, but here's our answer. Our God can save us from the fire. And then this is where the message comes out. But even if he doesn't, we will not worship you or any other God. And that right there, that little turn, that confidence in God's goodness with the resolve to worship him when that goodness doesn't look maybe the way that they want it to look in their life, that is the essence of the Even If message, a declaration, so to speak, when life doesn't go the way you want it to, when it's disappointing, when it's a weird turn, it's unexplainable. Like, will you worship God in the midst of that? And that's what I really try to unpack in the book.
Yeah, wow. That's deep, and that's something that I think all of us can relate to and probably have a hard time processing on our own. I mean, you're right about the time early on in your ministry where when were let go from 2 churches. How did that affect you, and how did you determine to keep pursuing your pastoral calling? And would you mind just hashing that a little bit more as you talk about it in your book?
Sure, through a variety of circumstances, but as I've reflected on it over almost 20 years of what that wilderness period was, I really thought I was done, Moses. I thought, I had really just literally, I had gotten fired from my first church about a month before I graduated from seminary, right? And this is a church that I was my home church more than 20 years. And then shortly thereafter, I was fired from another one, which I was in a very unhealthy state. I should not have jumped into that ministry. They were just lovely, wonderful people, but I was not in a healthy spot. And when I got fired from that second one, I really thought I was done. And of course, when we face disappointment, there's no shortage of explanations that will be offered by other people or that will come to it ourselves, right? That I must have done something, or I did something to disqualify myself, or God's passed me by. I'm no longer fit for ministry. I mean, I really thought I was done. In fact, I ended up managing my mom's deli for about a year and a half in that wilderness. thinking to myself, my pride, it must have been my pride, my arrogance. That's the reason why God has cast me out of this. I really believed like that was it. That was the end of it. Because again, the circumstances didn't match up. And it was actually in that time when I picked up this little book by Richard Sibbes called A Bruised Reed, right? Which is based on his meditations around Isaiah 42, a bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not extinguish. And it's when I began to see, like, wait a second, who really is God? When I say God is good, what do I mean by that? Even if that goodness doesn't look the way that I think it should in my life, or for my ministry, or for my work right now, will I continue to worship him? Man, it changed. It changed so much of the way I viewed pastoral ministry, and continues to do so. A couple of ways. Number one, wow, like so much of pastoral ministry, we start with affirmation, right? Like you're affirmed. Yeah, your ordination is a matter of affirmation. You know these things, you have the skill, you have the character, and so much of that is all affirmations. But then we all face these kind of periods in our ministries where it doesn't work the way we want, like a relationship falls out, or we're trying the best we can and we just feel like we can't win, or the results aren't coming, or the success that we're told and promised isn't happening, even though we're trying to be obedient to the Lord. Like, how do we understand God's goodness in there? That wilderness period made me realize that so much of my trust in God was based on him doing what I wanted him to do. And when I found myself in the wilderness, totally exposed, no longer serving at a church, I was like, where's my identity really going to lie? Right? And can I worship this God? I mean, I was facing this furnace, and it was one of the most trembling declarations I had to make, that even if God never allowed me to be back in a church leading as a pastor, I would continue to worship him. I would continue to believe his gospel, and I would continue to believe that Jesus was enough. That declaration really set the trajectory for my ministry and for future decisions about where I would live or what kind of church I would serve in, all these sort of stuff. It really released me to a kind of freedom that I could worship God and leave the results and success or lack thereof to him.
Wow. And that got me thinking a lot about even myself as a church planner, because I think as an East Asian church planter, East Asian American church planter, for us, it's like the scariest thing about church planting is failure and the shame that comes from failing, right? It doesn't even have to be moral failure, the fact that you close shop, right?
Yeah.
And the terrifying prospect, definitely, that I had to wrestle through, and I had to come to peace with that possibility that I could fail, and I need to be okay with failing because my identity is not in being in church planting. But it's hard, It's like you think you're over it, and then that temptation comes back, right?
Totally, right? And that's why this even if declaration isn't just a one-time, like, hey, I made the declaration. I try to use the illustration of it. It's actually an even if tapestry that God writes through your life, one thread at a time, right? So just when you think that you're, okay, I've got this even if resolved now, right? Like, then the next support raising cycle comes, and now okay, wait a second, I've got to fight for people's approval. I've got to prove to them that this endeavor is justifiable, right? So difficult as we as ministers of the gospel have to operate sometimes by proving our existence, proving that we're worth the investment or whatever. And we can get locked into, what I call the counter ifs. So not even if, but we live by other things like conditionals, right? So only if God will do this, will I worship him. Only if we have a successful launch, or only if, my kid grows up to be a certain thing. And the most subtle thing about that is nobody comes to God with a strong condition right off the bat. It starts with a very sincere desire. Like, oh, if God would heal, if God would provide, if God would move, right? And suddenly that kind of expectation or that desire, well, actually that desire turns into an expectation, becomes a need, and then becomes this demand of a condition. Only if God, right, you do this. So sometimes that rules our hearts, or as I've been reflecting more on this, our regrets rule our hearts. So instead of an even if, we live an if only kind of life where we're like locked in the past, right? You can probably imagine those and remember those golden ages, those golden periods of ministry whenever it was so sweet, right? And you can still think fondly of the people that you served with. And we can face a new endeavor and we can say, man, if only it was like that. If only I could go back to that. If only I could go back to that more place where I was more passionate. I had more energy. I had more, whatever, charisma, if only. And we can lock ourselves in this kind of nostalgic past, or maybe for some listening to this, you're locked in a broken past, right? Where it's like, man, you have your regrets, the mistakes you've made, the shame you live in. And you say, if only I can make up for that, right? Then God will be pleased with me. So there's those kind of regrets as well. That actually the most, the most dangerous, I think, of regret is actually the fantasy regret. And John Bloom actually talks about this. It was a blog post on desiring God, but he talks about these regrets that you can know because you use these words like, I should by now, right? Like, I should have a church that is X amount of people by now, or I should be over that sin by now. I should. And we're constantly comparing ourselves with this life that we should be living. Like maybe there's some people listening right now and you're a single and you're like, I should be married by now, right? And your parents remind you of that, and your circles remind you of that. Your friends are all getting married, they're having kids, and you're like, I should be. And we can lock ourselves in those regrets too, and they keep us from moving forward. Right. And then your third is like, you got your only ifs, you got your if onlys, you got your what ifs, these contingency plans. Like, what if this doesn't go? And it's our attempts to control and force the outcome that we want. And in my book, I talk about how an even if declaration rooted in the gospel actually allows us to address each of these in honest and authentic ways, not casting it aside, but naming what the desire is and acknowledging the pain of not seeing that desire come to be, but also renewing and resolving to trust God that he is good and that he'll bring about, might be different than what I want, but he'll bring about yet something for his glory and my good. And,
Wow.
mm,
That's good, especially because I think a lot of people are coming out of this pandemic with a lot of like regrets and a lot of fears, and I'm sure a lot of what if this happened, or just a lot of questions about how to move forward. So I guess even as I think about entering a new season of life after this pandemic, um, and people are thinking about next steps in their career, their education, or family, like what encouragement would you offer to those people who are anxious about what's next and who are afraid of failure, especially in light of this pandemic and this season?
yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the core, this might sound so elementary, but one of the core practices of living an even if kind of faith is to remember. In fact, I've heard it said like, oh, the most often the most repeated command, right, in the scriptures is do not fear or be strong, courageous, that sort of thing. Actually, if you increase the semantic range though of that, like the idea of the command to remember or do not forget, I think appears more in the scriptures. Like God is very intent that we remember who he is and what he has done. You see it echo throughout the entire Old Testament, right? I mean, God is so intent that we should remember that he established feasts. And because he knows that we're prone to forget, he puts food, right? He attaches food to them and makes it an occasion and says, this is what I want you to remember. And we're losing very quickly the ability to remember, right? And I stumbled upon this as I was writing, the difference between remembering and recalling, right? Recalling is just about stringing events together. It's what Facebook does for us. It gives us the timeline. And just as a note, like how many times have you been surprised when you're like Facebook shares with you a memory and you're like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that, right? But the significance of that, why that touches you, is not just that, oh yeah, you don't think about, oh yeah, I went that thing, we had that. You remember what happened, the people, the significance of that event is what causes you to go, oh yeah, that's what I call remembering, right? Remembering who God is and what he has done. as we're coming out of the pandemic, and there's still so much uncertainty, and that uncertainty it always has been there, honestly. It just took a pandemic to wake us up to it. But we got to recover the practice of remembering who God is. Okay, how has God been faithful and good to me? And if that data is too short or too foggy in your mind, I mean, this is where the historical data of the scriptures is so helpful to us. Like right now in my Bible reading, I've been reading through First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles, kind of in step with each other, and just recounting, wow, so many times God's faithfulness in spite of their faithlessness. It's doing something in me as I'm remembering, oh, God did that for them, right? I mean, I got to think about that for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? I mean, let's just take it out of a Bible story for a moment. And if we just think about their human situation, like they're saying, our God can deliver us from the fire. And even if he doesn't, we're not worshiping anyone else. If you just look at their life experience with God, like how could they really say that? I mean, think about like, these guys are youth growing up in Jerusalem. Sure, they hear the prophecy of Jeremiah, right? But they're hearing all these other false prophets saying, don't listen to Jeremiah. Don't know what he's talking about. And then God hands the city over. And then these three young men, they're literally trafficked to Babylon, given new names, acculturated, assimilated. And then they're saying before this king, like who did it all, our God can save us. Like what, from their own personal experience, like what were they looking to say that God could save them? Maybe they had some things where they could say it, but maybe also they were looking a little bit broader. Maybe they were looking at the way that God delivered them from the Assyrians before. Maybe they were looking at the way that God delivered their people from Egypt way before that. Like there's a greater body of data. And we who at this moment of history, in God's revelation of understanding the cross, the gospel, all that Jesus has done for us, and that nothing can separate us from his love. Like we have this immense body of data, right, to look at and say, okay, like it's not good right now. We can say that. But God has been so good. Right? And if I've got nothing else to fall on, even in my own life, like I got a lady in my church, like she's late 50s, her whole life she suffered physically, just suffered. Yet she can say, man, my Savior loves me, right? That remembering, that's my encouragement. Hey, you're coming out of pandemic. We're coming out of pandemic. You're not sure what you're supposed to do. You're feeling a little fear. You're anxious. Kids going back to school. Remember God's goodness. Remember his goodness to you. I'll add this little piece because this has actually kind of been a new learning since the book came out, but I just took this class on traditions of prayer, and we spent a day in the class talking about night prayer, or the prayer of examen, from Ignatius Loyola. And Ignatius offers this examen, and it's so interesting. It starts with recollection or recalling God's presence with you, and then giving thanks for that. And then it goes to remembering the things of the day and how God's presence was with you or how you ignored that presence. And then it leads to this resolve. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's like the formula. That is like the even if life kind of summed up in this ancient practice of recalling, giving thanks, remembering, and then resolving, I'm going to worship you. And that's the encouragement I would give. I know that doesn't solve and answer every life situation, but I think it's a very important start.
Yeah, well, that's helpful. It's like remembering part is all rooted in just the fact that God is unchanging, right? That he's immutable, and that is the basis for which we can say that he still continues to be the same God as he was in Scripture. Now, that's good. Yeah, I guess sort of related to my previous question about the pandemic. I know it's also been very hard for minorities in our country the past 2 years. And Asian Americans have suffered in different ways in more recent months with the rise of anti-Asian racism, and it's just been really difficult for a lot of Asian Americans to navigate the space of multi-ethnic contexts. And I know you've been pastoring a multi-ethnic church for quite some time now, And I'm, as a minority in a majority white space, I'm sure you have your own stories of challenges and different ways that God has stretched you and whatever else. I don't know, like, how has that kind of experience impacted the way you're writing and your culture, even and your heritage? How has that impacted the way you pastor and minister and speak into cultural issues today?
That's a great question, Moses. I think in the writing and the pastoring in my context, I have become much more like okay, okay, and even proud of um, our immigrant heritage, and not just in a way that like flaunts it. You know, I think about, and I mean, I love this about the musical Hamilton, right? But like, immigrants, we get the job done, and they kind of throw these lines in there, and it's not so much that kind of like a pride thing, but like actually the immigrant journey, we have something to really contribute for the health of the overall church. Um, and I don't mean just along the lines of race. I mean for the life of the church, right? And as I was writing that's somebody who was reviewing the book for me, they noticed that and I didn't even notice it because it's become such a part of like this is actually just who I am, and whether you're a majority or whether you're a minority, you can actually learn something um, from this experience or this thing. And I just realized, oh my gosh, like so much of, at least even in the immigrant church, was driven by this even if faith without the words, right? We're going to suffer. Um, we're going to face setbacks, but we're going to continue to worship God, right? Now, it's not always as noble as that, right? Let's be honest, right? There's always, the underside of all of that. But I just see the beauty of that. And my encouragement to other Asian Americans, no matter what space you're in, um, because let's also not make like multi-ethnic space something more glorious and glamorous than ethnic churches. Like we have something to contribute beyond race. We have something to contribute about the way that we think about ecclesiology, the way we think about a pastoral theology and how a pastor relates um, to a congregation, to a church. We have some things to contribute there, and that's what I'm hoping. Actually, even if on a larger scale, will kind of demonstrate is that Asian American pastors, like, we have more to say to the church overall than just matters of race. And I hope it doesn't minimize it. I don't mean just matters of race as in like that's not. It's a hugely important thing. But I don't want Asian American pastors to feel like the only things that we're good for in the church is to speak about race. I think we've got lots of things to say about generational dynamics. Something I know that you've been observing and really commenting on as well. We've got things to say there. We've got things to say, like I said, about how church can run and work and all these kinds of things. So, and Christian life and how we engage with suffering, right? Theology of suffering, which I think our majority church is not really good at, right? They're not really good at grasping that. And yeah, that would be my encouragement. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good, and you're absolutely right. Sometimes people of color or we can feel like we can only speak into one particular issue as it comes to our immigrant or minority experience, but there's so much more we can say, and I think your book embodies that. So it's amazing to see another person of color and Asian American do that, where you're speaking into just broader issues that the American church faces, and not just on race. And it's something to celebrate, and I think all the people in our tribe should definitely. It's a win for all of us. So it's we're so happy that you wrote this book, and I don't know. I'm just really excited to learn from your brother.
Yeah, thanks, man. I'm super grateful for it. I got a copy of the hard copy right about when the publisher sent it to you, and I was just holding it and just it was always a dream in the back of my mind like 15 years ago. to maybe write down this message for someone else. Never really thought I would have the bandwidth or the space to do it, or the ability to do it actually. And man, each step was just a step of obedience, and each step was a step was of even if. Right when I wrote the proposal and we sent it out to 6-7 publishers, and like my safety publisher declined, and I was like, oh man, and there was a moment of even if there, like, okay, Lord, like I've been obedient, you are good. And even if I have to sell this book in the back of my trunk in a parking lot at Walmart, like I'm going to worship you and I'll do it. I'll be obedient to you. And let me just add that, like, the even if declaration is not just about, it won't just help you endure suffering or when life doesn't make sense. It'll actually, if we can embrace an even if kind of faith where we worship God, not contingent upon the circumstances or what's in it for me, it will allow us, I believe, I'm praying that it will release churches, Christians, to take next steps of risky faith, right? And I talk about risk in the book. It's not all risk is the same, but risky faith, to attempt things. I was always told growing up, like, hey, like if you don't talk about passion, right? Like if you knew you couldn't fail, what would you attempt to do, right? You'd heard that leadership question. I think that's actually the wrong question, right? I think it's, even with the possibility of failure, what's so important that you have to try anyway, right? And passion is not about zeal. It's about what you're willing to suffer for, right? What you're willing to carry your cross for. And that's what I'm praying for, is like that even if will be not just a comforting message, but it'll be a challenging one for those who are stuck in fear or paralyzed, or that, like if we say, even if, God, I'm going to worship you because you're worthy of this, and we feel like you're calling us to take the step, and we're going to take that step and leave the results to you. And if it doesn't go the way we hoped it would, we're still going to worship you. Can you just imagine what that would do? Like what we would attempt, yeah, that's what I pray would happen.
That's awesome. Yeah. No, I know a lot of friends who want a church plant, but their only option is to scratch plant. So I'm thinking about you. Let's do it. I mean, that's a very fitting way to end this conversation, and thank you for that takeaway from your book. Well, just want to again congratulate you so much on this book, and we just can't wait to get this in people's hands. And I hope we can do this again sometime. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, and I'd say I'd love to connect. I pride myself in trying to really be accessible. So, if the easiest way to connect is go to mitchellee.com, and there's a connect form there. And then I take that very seriously and would love to connect and offer any encouragement or further insights I can. Thanks for the opportunity, Moses.
Awesome. Thank you.